We didn't experience this even under the PRI. The PRI didn't have totalitarian propensities. It was a hegemonic party, an authoritarian party, but it coexisted with the opposition. This government doesn't compete or respect the opposition. It suppresses it. That is not a historical quote, Tavo. That is a very recent interview given by Enrique Krause, one of Mexico's most prominent historians and political commentators, very much against the current Morena government. And that's his verdict on last week's judicial election, where Mexico went to the polls, or at least 13% of voters did, to elect all the way up from the Supreme Court to the local judges and magistrates. Enrique Krause saw this as basically the death of the Republic. I'm here to argue he's completely wrong.
Now, you say he's completely wrong, Alex, but he's not alone. The Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index ranks Mexico's democracy A, as a hybrid democracy, not even a flawed democracy, and it has done so for over 20 years, and since 2018, it has fallen 15% in said ranking. Now, they're not alone. Also, another 7 international organizations and think tanks, including the World Bank, have voiced similar or even more alarming views.
I don't necessarily disagree that Mexico is a very flawed democracy, but to say it's worse than it has ever been sort of stands up in the face of what Mexicans think. The Economist Intelligence Unit's Latino Barometro, a really good survey of opinions about democracy in Latin America, has come up with the fact that most Mexicans are as satisfied as they've ever been. Over half of Mexicans are happy with the democracy as it stands. That's the highest it's ever been since Latino Barometro started during the PRI's authoritarian regime in 1994. So what gives, right? It sort of brings me back to an old university exam question we used to have back when we were doing political philosophy. Would you rather be poor in a democracy or rich in an autocracy? I don't think Mexico is exactly dividable between these two options, but it definitely gives us an idea, right? The Morena government in power right now, with a supermajority, democratically elected, enormously popular, does have a few anti-democratic hitches to be complained about. And I think that's what we're going to go over in this episode. Whether Mexico is a democracy or not, I think depends a lot about how people feel they are personally in the face of politics as they stand, and also Mexico's history. And this is where I think Krause is so wrong when he talks about what was called the perfect dictatorship of the PRI. The PRI was in government for 71 years. They did regular elections, but fraud was a massive part of them, especially at the beginning. I remember you saying when we were talking about political violence in a previous podcast, the most violent election ever was the one right after Lázaro Cárdenas' election, which was the establishment of this party, this one-party state, a complete bloodbath, which nobody quite likes to remember. And even Octavio Paz, who we've talked about in another episode, was really upset when in 1990, Mario Vargas Llosa, the Nobel Prize-winning Peruvian author who died recently, came out and he said, at the tail end of decades of a long authoritarian regime, gave the PRI system that name, the moniker of the perfect dictatorship, because it goes through all the motions of a democracy, but never relinquishes power. That's the fear that people have about Morena now, especially after this judicial reform, which completely upends the traditional division of powers. But what the government would tend to say is that that division of powers was born of a corrupt system. It was born in sin, so to speak, because it was created by the PRI to an extent to create an institutional model based on its own vision. But let's go back a bit. I'd like to talk about when the last time Mexico really felt like an actual dictatorship was. And that was actually pretty recent. It was in 1977, during a pretty botched election in which the main opposition parties were either banned or opted to stay out, and it was humiliating to the PRI regime. It was 100% of the votes going to a single candidate, their candidate, which you would think they'd celebrate, But of course they didn't. They were very disappointed with the fact that they no longer looked like a democracy. And that led to a bunch of reforms, which has led us to the structure that we've seen now. Now, the Morena government, I think, wrongly complains a lot about the liberal institutionalism that was created. They say it's the neoliberal institutions that make this country as bad as it is because they defend private interests, and that's what they're trying to overthrow, right? With democratic elections of judges, with the supermajority that they've got democratically, to be honest. What I think is interesting is there is another legacy of the PRI, and it's not so much the institutions that it created to usher Mexico into a flawed democracy in the year 2000. It actually happened right after this terrible election of 1977. The government came in, the newly elected government, with 100% of the votes and says, this can't happen again. And so what they did was they passed a new law, and it was a big political reform across Mexico. And what it did was it legalized the Communist Party. It made it much easier for parties to exist within the hybrid authoritarian regime that existed in Mexico at the time. But it was a poison chalice from the PRI. It elevated political parties for the first time in Mexican history to constitutional status. And what it did was it created a party-centered political system, not a democracy, but one in which nobody gets to participate outside of a party, where parties are incentivized to care only about themselves. And that is the system that we currently live in, but one which Morena is quite happy to exist within because it has benefited enormously. Just to give you an idea of how it works, even though it's a really convoluted system, and if you want to read more about it, we actually wrote about this in the Mexico Political Economist. If you want to have a look at the show notes, that's where it'll be. But it's literally just billions of pesos, billions with a B, massive amounts of pesos, which for Morena is close to hundreds of millions of dollars every time they go to the ballot. Every vote you get is money that you're getting from the state. So it's a taxpayer-funded budget for party, which gave them autonomy to face the PRI during its perfect dictatorship, but which now has created a terrible system in which votes function to make more money, to pay electoral clienteles, to churn out more votes, to make more money. It's a system of government, of the parties, by the parties, and for the parties. Now, the question is, why is this relevant to the collapse of democracy today? My main argument, and I think this has been the argument for most people after the judicial reform calamity. Why was it a calamity? It was a calamity for the opposition because they said it was the beginning of the end of the Mexican Republic, but it was also a calamity for Morena because so few people turned out to vote. It was incredibly difficult to understand. Very few people believed in the process, and so only 13% of people turned out to vote. But I think that was a mistake because even though, and this is kind of funny, blank and voided votes made up about 20% of those votes emitted, which was way more than any single candidate got. Null and blank do not take up seats in the Supreme Court. The winners do. And so what the opposition did was hand a victory to Morena's candidates. They could have gone in. They say it was unfair because they weren't allowed to organize, but of course they were. This is the issue with the dependence of parties on a system that only relies on parties. In the 1970s, the PAN actually warned its members. It says, if we become a party-centric system, we'll be taking financing from the state, and it will be the beginning of the end. We'll stop knowing how to organize internally. So to me, this is the main issue, the fact that the opposition didn't compete within the judicial election and handed a one-party state to the current government. And we've seen it over and over again.
Now, I think the problem here actually starts a very long time ago, as you say, in the 1970s and possibly even before. Now, you talk about the PAN, and the thing about the PAN is that they were the opposition for the longest time. They were the loyal opposition, and I emphasize the loyal part. They knew that since this was a dictatorship, they were never actually going to gain power, but they could at least influence the direction of things by playing the role of being the opposition. However, when they do come to power in the year 2000, what becomes apparent, or at least it seems that way to me, is that their long history of being the opposition for the sake of being the opposition meant that they had no real idea of how to govern. I think a good example of that is when Felipe Calderón starts the war on drugs in 2006. His spiel is very academic. He says we're here to defend the rule of law, but he has no idea about the reality of what implementing these kinds of policies will look like on the ground, something that the PRI was very good at. They were fundamentally focused on governing and not necessarily overly encumbered by actual democracy. The same thing happened with the PRD. This was the left-wing opposition, which was born in the 1980s. They never actually make it to power. They were dissolved in 2024 without ever holding the presidency. And you saw that as well in the course of their entire existence, where all they did was be the opposition, but not in a particularly constructive way. And what we've seen in these recent elections, where the opposition chose in majority to not show up, or if they showed up to not vote for a particular candidate, it's the same idea. It's, I will do this on principle without a real regard for what it will do to the governing of the country.
And that's a disaster. Ultimately, that lack of pragmatism only hands power to an already overpowered party in government. And the worst part is it doesn't have to be that way. One of the things about the PAN, especially during that pre-democratic age in the year 2000, was that they were very good at organizing with very little money. Now, sometimes they did it legally, but a lot of the time, I'd say most of the time, they did it by organizing everyday people. Because the PAN is so dependent on a political clientele based on the money they get from elections, they've completely lost touch with their bases. And you can see that with the number of actual members of the party today. Back in the day, the party used to work as a core that organized civil society. That was their whole shtick. The PRI was in government. They didn't represent Mexicans. They just governed. The PAN was in civil society, organizing to someday bring democracy to Mexico. And you could see it. I interviewed Manuel Cloutier, who is the son of a legendary candidate for the presidency under the PAN. Same name, Manuel Cloutier. And his son remembered how at meetings and rallies, they'd pass a hat around to get some cash to pay for the transport, to pay for the posters. They were a grassroots movement, something which Morena is the only party that can currently claim to be. They still continue to go out into the streets. That's actually a policy instituted by the party and very much supported by President Claudia Sheinbaum. The idea of menos escritorio, más territorio, which is don't hit the books, hit the streets, go out and organize. And that's something that Morena is doing to enormous protests from the opposition, which I agree, maybe a lot of it is state-funded, that would be illegal, but that's beside the point. The PAN should reach back into its history and look at how effectively they used to organize with very few funds and with an idea of winning back democracy through the ballot box, not by staying at home.
And I think this opens up an interesting question, which you alluded to at the beginning of the conversation, which is Mexicans feel at large that this government really represents them, that the democracy is working for them, even though the pundits and the academics and the opposition say this is undemocratic. Well, I think we need to also acknowledge that different places understand and live democracy in different ways. And in Mexico is a place that does have a long culture of people congregating at town square, and in that particular way of congregation, feeling that they are a part of a particular movement, be that what it may. If that is being applied to democracy, then who's to say that's not a democratic movement? And that is what Morena profoundly understands.
And that's, funnily enough, something the other parties now in the opposition used to understand until they bought what I think is the terrible downfall of intellectuals like Krause, which is they became overly academic and institutionalized. Now, I love the idea of institutions, especially as someone who studied politics at university. But the idea of autonomous institutions to do trust busting and also autonomous and independent courts, that to me makes a lot of sense. The issue is, when these academically minded people eventually get to power, they're not very good at governing with these institutions. And over the course of the decades, after instituting them in the early 2000s, people start losing faith. And that's what's made it so easy for Morena to come in and dismantle them. They've come in and said, so we've got a trust-busting institution since the early 2000s. Do we have monopolies in Mexico? The answer is, we're basically made of monopolies. What did the antitrust organization actually do? The judicial branch, has it got issues? Massive issues. Let's just change it. Nobody really understands how the judicial branch works. And I think that was a big point of this election. Put the spotlight on the judges. Now, we've had a long debate over whether or not this is a good reform. I personally believe it's a terrible reform. It's badly done. It's been rushed. But the way that the opposition has dealt with it has handed power directly to the government. And that's not something that historically, I believe, they would have done. It actually shows that the reason we're seeing a failing in Mexican democracy is because the opposition parties are simply not up to the task. But do you want to hear something interesting, Tavo? If anything, this judicial reform has proved one really important thing that I don't think anyone has spoken enough about, which is parties, no matter which ones they are, cannot conceive of an election without parties, without themselves. We saw this in lots of ways, right? In theory, this election was meant to be a non-partisan election in which judges came out on their own attributes without any party backing. Parties could not deal with this. On one side, we had the opposition, which stayed at home because they didn't know how to organize what they said was a state-run election, which turned out not to be true. The government and people who believed in the election tried to mobilize people and failed miserably. This is why I'm so upset with the opposition, because they could have put lots of really good, independently minded judges who were on the ballot by pushing for them, not as parties, but by mobilizing trusted figures, by talking, by going out into the town square. That didn't happen because they were too busy having a tantrum, while Morena tried to influence the election and yet failed miserably. And so when ruling parties tried to meddle, they did very poorly, but they did better than the ones that didn't try.
And here I wonder about something. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But when you describe the way the opposition behaved, when you talk about people like Enrique Krause, it takes me back to sort of the history of the process of democratization of Mexico throughout the 20th century, which is the PRI is an authoritarian regime that progressively becomes more and more democratic, partially because people are demanding it, partially because there is some international pressure for it, partially because they need to because of what's happening politically in the country. But when the PRI's regime ends and the new government comes in, there is no fundamental dismantling of the structures that they left behind. And it seems to me that the opposition, like the PAN, they only really know how to operate within the confines of the system created by the PRI. So when Morena comes in and creates a new system or pushes for a new system, it seems to me that they have no real idea of how they should tackle the situation.
That's the main question that no one's taking seriously and that I think the opposition hasn't even conceived of, which is if you've been democratically elected, and let's remember, Morena has a supermajority in Congress, by the way, because of the corruption of the opposition parties. Let's not forget that a lot of the people in Morena now were bought over, and I said bought over, from the PAN and from other previously opposition candidates because they're full of incredibly corrupt people, right? It's, and again, another issue of these loyalty-based parties in power at the moment based on this poison chalice that the PRI instituted in 1977. Now, what you've got is a debate about how legitimately a democratically elected party can change a system's rules. The answer is it can change the system's rules because they've been elected to do so. In fact, that was literally what Claudia Sheinbaum campaigned on. She knew she was going to win. What they campaigned on was Plan C, which was the so-called independent institutions are blocking our path to reform Mexico into a less unequal place, into a richer place. That's a different conversation about how effective they've been. The argument stood with the majority of the Mexican population who voted for that change. Because the opposition simply cannot conceive of a system that they themselves didn't create, they throw their toys out of the pram and say that there is no longer a democracy simply because it's not the democracy that they conceived of 30 years ago.
Now, what is true, and I think we need to acknowledge, is that under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, there were some quite alarming things that happened. I think most importantly is both the rhetoric that went against the National Electoral Institute, which was generally very highly regarded internationally, and reforms that he carried out to reduce the funding of this sort of watchdog, which is a key element of a functioning democracy. And when I say a functioning democracy, I mean specifically the belief that a voter must have that their vote will be counted in the way that they cast it.
Exactly right. And if anyone's a hero in this election, it is the staff and the institution of the INE, the National Electoral Institute. They were given about half the budget they required to set up this election. And I was there as an electoral observer, independent of any party, independent of any organization. I went to the polling stations, I went to the main offices of the INE, and the professionalism that I saw under such budgetary hardship, to me, was so impressive. Because ultimately, even though the money does go to a centralized independent authority, the people who are doing the counting are Mexican citizens. It's the people going out to vote and to count their own votes as the election goes on. That to me is what's most inspiring and what most tells me that Mexico is still very much a democracy, because you can try to meddle, and we saw a lot of that, but you will be caught out by the citizens doing the counting and surveying these elections, and those votes will be discounted. There's been lots of issues, actually, with the other two elections that went on the same day. They were local elections. These were run by parties, and we saw lots of very different things that worry me, but also bring a lot of hope to the conversation. Number one is, now that parties, in this case, in the state of Veracruz and Durango, were inserted back into the equation, we saw Morena, but also the PRI and the PAN, doing their same old tricks, trying to influence the election, sometimes by literally meddling with a few of the ballots, sometimes by stealing ballots. We saw a lot of that go on, and that's pretty unacceptable, but that is not unique to Morena. That is unique to the Mexican political system as it has existed over the past 100 years.
Definitely. Let me just point out there, I was not an observer on this occasion, but I was an observer in the 2012 presidential election, and the exact same thing happened. I was incredibly surprised and proud of how well things were done in the ballots in the booths that I was charged with supervising. But when Enrique Peña Nieto was elected president that day, there was ample evidence of extensive corruption and meddling happening all over the country. So this is not a Morena thing. This is a thing in Mexico. And there's not a big difference between what happened in 2012, what happened last week, and what has happened in so many elections in Mexico's history.
Exactly right. And so that brings me to the hopeful bit, because Durango, a northern state, saw interventionism by the local alliance that runs the state, which is the PRI and the PAN. Veracruz, which is run by Morena, saw meddling from Morena. All utterly undemocratic, all utterly unsurprising. And yet, the good news was, the meddling didn't work. It wasn't broad enough, it wasn't widespread enough, and it was caught out by the citizens on time for the INE to be able to do something about it. And what's interesting to me is the opposition won. When the opposition actually ran a campaign, actually put the effort in and turned up, Morena lost. And there's nothing that proves it more to me than President Sheinbaum going out of her way to spend an entire morning presser to explain how she didn't actually lose. Actually, they won because they're currently governing more people, even though they lost an enormous amount of municipalities. So technically, yes, they govern more people, but only on the technicality that those municipalities have a few more people in them. But actually, other parties won in those spaces when they came out, voted, observed, and took an interested role in the democratic process, which still exists in Mexico.
One thing that's important is, as always, the devil is in the details. Something that I was quite terrified by when I read it in the Mexico Political Economist last week is when you look at the specifics of the failures in the counting system, specifically for the election of the members of the judiciary. The way elections are usually done in Mexico is that the first counting of all the votes happens in front of the citizens. So unless you steal the ballot and forge them at a massive scale, you can't really have widespread fraud.
And you get caught out as well. People would see you stealing them.
Exactly. Now, the problem in this particular election is that the counting would have been basically impossible because the options were so complicated that there was no counting of those votes, the ones specifically focused on members of the judiciary. There was no counting on the day. So there is no way of being certain that the numbers that the government said afterwards were the actual numbers.
Yes. And what's interesting to me is that was something I observed while I was there. The INE was very defensive about it, understandably. They're doing their best, and the system is pretty tight. But there was an issue with the transport of the ballots, which was they packed them up after they'd been cast, and instead of counting them there and then under everyone's scrutiny, they were shipped off without anyone being able to look at them. The INE, I think wrongly, didn't permit anyone to ride along with them, even if they were accredited official observers. And so they were set off with a taxi driver, literally, for 2 hours, which I believe is a really good way of giving criminals, interested parties, or political parties the space to replace ballots. Because the only thing we know is how many ballots were at this place. They say, oh, the ballots are sealed. Well, yes, but of course I can seal a plastic bag and stick a bunch of ballots in them as well with the same amount of papers in them. And so does that mean that this election was rigged? No, I don't think so, simply because it was so convoluted. The government was just as rushed as the INE, just as rushed as citizens were. It doesn't seem like there was much space or scope to do any malfeasance. But the issue is, of course, because this was such a rushed election, we had a lot of issues all along the way. And again, right, it brings us back to the fact that this was a pretty terrible reform. Not only do people not understand what they were voting for, sometimes they were surprised by how many ballots they got, but other times it was simply the fact that the system was rushed, and so there's lots of vulnerabilities along it. What does the government have to do? It has to lick its wounds, understood that actually, even though its candidates did win, it lost. This democratic exercise was a success to the extent that it proved that citizens can continue to survey and count Mexican elections in a trustworthy way. But the way the election was designed was a complete failure. And that's something the government, with its continuing supermajority, needs to consider as we move forward.
No, Morena has not been known to be a party that accepts mistakes easily. It is not a very self-critical organization. But given that everything points to the fact that they're here to stay, if not only entirely controlling the government, but as a very significant party for the years to come, then we can only hope, for the sake of Mexican democracy, that they will be critical of their own mistakes. I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez-Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're talking about Mexico, its history, economy, politics.
And why you, wherever you are in the world, are deeply affected by it every single day.
Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist and read about everything we've talked about on this podcast and far more.
And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to subscribe there and give us a like.